I'm Trevor, and what would you do if 14 students under your care during a school trip suddenly vanished after they saw Bigfoot? This actually happened, but that's not even the most horrific part of this story. What followed was a series of discoveries so brutal that Bigfoot revealed a truth far darker than any missing persons report. The ranger said that it was a routine school trip. One coach, 14 elementary students, 2 vans, and a drop-off point nearly 11 miles from the nearest paved road. He said it was a place you trusted because nothing ever seemed to happen there. Then, as the light died, multiple children, independently, without coordinating with each other, pointed at the same area of darkness and describing the same thing, a large shadow, moving upright. And here's what I keep coming back to. 14 exhausted children don't hallucinate the same shape in the same place at the same time. What those kids saw at that tree line was only the beginning. The children wouldn't stop pointing. That's the detail the ranger kept returning to in our interview. Not that they screamed, not that they ran, but that they just kept pointing, arms extended toward the northeast edge of the tree line, voices overlapping into a single insistent noise. The coach shut it down fast. Overactive imaginations, he told them. Bears looked big in the fog. Everyone went back to their tents. The ranger didn't contradict him, not out loud, but he walked the perimeter anyway, flashlight cutting low arcs through the mist. He found nothing he could name. He told himself the same thing the coach had: fog, distance, tired eyes. He almost believed it. Then he saw Bigfoot, not a shape, not a disturbance in the brush. He saw Bigfoot standing at the northeast tree line, partially framed by 2 fir trunks, motionless, and the ranger's first coherent thought, the one he said he was almost embarrassed to admit, was that whatever he was looking at was too tall to be a man and too still to be an animal. The shoulders cleared 8 feet without question. The silhouette was bipedal, fully upright, with a mass through the chest and arms that registered as wrong against the normal scale of the forest behind it. Bigfoot wasn't hiding. Bigfoot was watching, standing in the open just far enough inside the shadows to make the ranger's flashlight beam dissolve before it landed cleanly, but close enough that the shape was unmistakable. The ranger did not tell the coach what he saw. He made a note of the position, checked the perimeter markers, small reflective flags he'd staked at 20-foot intervals, and went back to his tent. By morning, 3 of those markers had been physically displaced, not knocked over by wind, moved deliberately and repositioned several feet inward toward the camp's center. The soft soil around them should have held prints. It held nothing. No compression, no drag, no trace that anything with weight had touched the ground, which the ranger said in a voice that had gone very flat by this point in our conversation was in some ways more disturbing than finding tracks would have been. Nobody slept. That's not a figure of speech. The ranger said that by midnight, genuine sleep had effectively ended for the entire camp. It started with footsteps, not the soft, irregular movement of an animal circling at a distance, but a heavy, rhythmic, deliberate impact pattern that the ranger described as methodical. Each step landed with enough weight to vibrate the ground slightly, and the kids felt it through their sleeping pads before they heard it with their ears. They started waking in clusters, 2 or 3 at a time, then 5, then all 14, sitting upright in their tents, completely silent, listening to something walk the boundary of their camp in long, unhurried strides. Then Bigfoot started working the environment. The first branch came down somewhere north of the campsite. Not a deadfall, not wind damage, but a green limb, roughly 4 inches thick, snapped cleanly at a height the ranger estimated at somewhere between 9 and 11 feet off the ground. Then a second. Then a rock the size of a cantaloupe skipped across the clearing and stopped 10 feet short of the tent cluster, having apparently been thrown from the tree line at an angle that suggested both distance and considerable force. The ranger was clear that none of these made direct contact with the group. They weren't meant to. They were demonstrations, deliberate, escalating, and perfectly spaced, as if Bigfoot was giving the camp time to process each one before delivering the next. The coach's response made everything worse. He moved through the tents in the dark, issuing sharp, quiet commands. Stay down, don't open the zippers, don't use lights. His logic wasn't wrong exactly, but the delivery stripped the children of the one thing that might have steadied them, which was the sense that an adult was not also frightened. The ranger could hear the shakiness the coach was trying to suppress, and he said the kids could hear it too. The group cohesion that had held through the evening simply dissolved. The ranger swept the tree line with his flashlight at 1:15 in the morning and caught Bigfoot mid-stride, not fleeing, not flinching, just turning away at a pace that communicated complete indifference to the light. Bigfoot wasn't startled. Bigfoot was done with that particular pass and was simply moving on to the next one. What the ranger just witnessed was Bigfoot running a pattern, a controlled, intelligent, circular pattern around 14 children. And when dawn finally came, the most terrifying discovery wasn't what was there, it was what was gone. The ranger said the silence woke him. Not a sound, not movement, silence. The specific total absence of the footstep pattern that had run unbroken for hours. It stopped somewhere around 4:40 in the morning, and that stillness should have been a relief. Instead, it snapped him awake faster than any alarm could have, because his nervous system had spent the entire night calibrating to that rhythm, and the sudden absence of it felt like a held breath. He was outside his tent within seconds, flashlight already in hand, and the camp looked undisturbed. Tent zipped, gear in place, the fire pit cold. He did a visual sweep, counted the tent shapes, and told himself the worst was over. He was wrong. When the coach began the morning head count at first light, the tents were empty, all of them. Zippers intact, sleeping bags still loosely formed in the shapes of the children who had been inside them. Personal items untouched, shoes still paired at tent entrances, water bottles still standing upright. 14 children were simply gone from a secured campsite with no signs of forced exit, no sounds of departure, and no footprints leading away from the perimeter in any direction the ranger could immediately identify. The coach's voice, the ranger told me, went through 3 distinct phases in about 90 seconds. Confusion, then denial, then something that stopped being a recognizable emotion entirely. The ranger keyed his radio and got static. He moved 40 feet north toward higher ground and got partial contact, enough to transmit a broken location call before the signal dropped again. A full backup request may or may not have gone through. He didn't know. He still doesn't know exactly how much of that transmission was received. And then, while the ranger was standing in the clearing trying to re-establish radio contact, and the coach was moving in rapid, directionless circles at the campsite behind him, the ranger heard movement in the tree line to the west. Not random movement, parallel movement. Whatever was in those trees was traveling at exactly the same speed he was, maintaining exact distance, tracking his position with a precision that made his blood drop cold, because Bigfoot had not left. Bigfoot had simply stopped announcing itself. The circling hadn't ended. It had just gone quiet. And now, with 14 children missing and backup uncertain, Bigfoot was still right there. But nothing could have prepared the ranger for what Bigfoot did next. They moved into the tree line together, the ranger and the coach, following the only logical search corridor, a shallow drainage channel that ran northwest from the campsite and was wide enough to move through quickly. The ranger took point. The coach stayed 6 feet behind him, and for the first quarter mile, the only sounds were their own footsteps. They split at the first fork. Standard search protocol: expand the radius, cover more ground, regroup at a fixed landmark. The ranger took the eastern branch. The coach took the western, and within 4 minutes of separating, Bigfoot made the shift from surveillance to interference so abruptly that the ranger said it felt like a door being kicked open. The first stone hit a Douglas fir 12 feet to the ranger's left with a crack loud enough to echo off the canyon wall. Before that echo finished, a second stone struck a tree to his right, not close enough to make contact, close enough to bracket him. Then the vocalizations started. The ranger struggled to describe them in our interview, landing eventually on a sound that combined the resonance of something very large with a frequency that he said he felt in his sternum before he consciously registered hearing it with his ears. It rolled through the canyon in overlapping waves, and it did not stop. Bigfoot was not calling out once and waiting. Bigfoot was projecting continuous, layered sound that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, and the ranger could not locate a single point of origin. He discharged 2 warning shots into the upper tree line, standard deterrent. The vocalizations paused for exactly 3 seconds. Then they resumed, louder, and the ranger heard Bigfoot repositioning through the brush to his north at a speed that was deeply inconsistent with the dense undergrowth that should have slowed anything moving through it. Bigfoot wasn't deterred. Bigfoot was annoyed. And somewhere on the western fork of that drainage, the coach had just stopped responding to radio checks entirely. The ranger keyed his mic one more time, got nothing but static, and made the only decision that made sense in that moment. He abandoned the eastern trail and cut hard toward the western fork, hoping to intercept the coach before whatever had silenced him could finish the job. He took 3 strides before a massive spruce limb snapped across his path, not falling, but thrown, the fresh break in its wood still weeping sap, and he knew without a doubt that Bigfoot had anticipated his move and was now actively steering him. The ranger dropped low and scrambled under the limb, his palms scraping against bark and mud, and as he came up on the other side, he caught a flash of dark fur moving through the ferns, maybe 40 feet to his left, not running but pacing him, matching his speed with an ease that made his own desperate sprint feel like wading through wet concrete. He raised his sidearm and fired a third shot into the dirt ahead of the creature, a hard crack of impact that kicked up a spray of loam. And Bigfoot responded by slamming both fists into the trunk of a nearby hemlock with a sound like a car wreck, the whole tree shuddering and raining needles down on the ranger's head as he ducked and veered right. The ground beneath his boots pitched sharply downward, a hidden washout that sent him sliding on his back through a channel of loose stone and rotting leaves, and he caught himself against a boulder just before he would have tumbled into a creek bed where the water ran fast and black over moss-slickened rocks. He pushed himself upright, his left knee screaming from the impact, and that's when he heard the first real movement from the creature, not the quiet repositioning of before, but a full crashing charge through the brush to his south, coming straight for him with branches snapping like gunfire and the heavy rhythm of footfalls that shook the ground. The ranger fired twice more, wild shots that tore through ferns and clipped a sapling in half, and Bigfoot swerved at the last possible second, close enough that the ranger felt the wind of its passing and smelled the thick, musky reek of its hide, like wet fur and old blood and something else he couldn't name. It circled behind him and hit the creek bed at a full sprint, crossing 20 feet of open water in 2 strides and sending up a curtain of spray that drenched the ranger from head to chest, and then it was on the far bank, waiting, its massive silhouette blocking the only viable crossing for as far as he could see in the fading light. The ranger holstered his weapon, not out of surrender, but because he understood now that the creature wanted him alive, wanted him moving in a specific direction, and every bullet he fired only seemed to tighten the invisible fence it was building around him. He turned east again, hoping to double back, and got no more than 50 feet before a fist-sized rock whizzed past his ear and shattered against a pine trunk, followed by a second stone that caught him in the shoulder hard enough to spin him halfway around and leave a bruise that would darken to purple before the hour was out. Bigfoot had circled ahead again, impossibly fast, and now it stood in the eastern gap with its arms spread wide, blocking the entire trail like a landslide given form, and the ranger understood with a cold certainty that he was not going to reach the western fork by choice. He was being driven there, step by step, as surely as a deer is driven toward a waiting rifle. He backed away slowly, hands raised and empty, and when Bigfoot took one deliberate step forward, he turned and ran west, not because he wanted to, but because the only other option was to stand there and wait for those enormous hands to close around him. The creature let him go, falling in behind him at a distance of maybe 60 feet, close enough that he could hear its breathing, deep, steady, almost patient, and the occasional crack of a branch under its feet as it followed his every twist and turn through the darkening timber. He crested a small rise and saw the western fork below him, the creek glinting through the trees, and he knew the coach was somewhere down there, either dead or wishing he was, and the thought drove his legs faster, even as his lungs burned and his vision narrowed to a tunnel of adrenaline and fear. A root caught his boot, and he went down hard, his chin striking the ground, and his teeth clicking together so sharply he tasted blood. And before he could push himself up, he heard Bigfoot break into a sprint behind him, closing the distance in a heartbeat. The ranger rolled onto his back, reaching for his sidearm, but the creature didn't touch him. It leaped over him instead, a shadow so vast it blocked the sky, and landed on the trail ahead with a ground-shaking impact that sent loose rocks skittering down the slope. It turned to face him, and for the first time he saw its eyes, dark and intelligent and gleaming with something that looked almost like amusement. And then it pointed one long arm down the western fork, a clear and unmistakable gesture that said, "Go that way, now." The ranger got to his feet, his hands trembling, and he went. And then the ranger heard the coach before he saw anything. Not words, a single sharp sound, half shout and half something else, the kind of noise a person makes when the air gets forced out of them by something they didn't see coming. The ranger broke from the eastern fork and pushed through the undergrowth toward the western channel at a dead run, branches catching his jacket, his boots sliding on the wet slope, covering roughly 300 feet in terrain that should have taken 4 times as long. He came through a gap in the fur line and stopped. Bigfoot was there, fully visible, no fog between them, no tree line to dissolve the edges, just Bigfoot, in open ground, at a distance the ranger estimated at 30 feet. And everything the ranger had partially glimpsed through mist and flashlight beam the night before now had full, terrible clarity. The height was real. The mass was real. The face, which the ranger refused to describe in specific detail even during our interview, was real in a way that he said his brain kept trying to reject, kept trying to file under something familiar, and couldn't. The coach was on the ground. Bigfoot was not standing over him casually. Bigfoot was engaged physically and deliberately with a focused aggression that the ranger described as targeted in a way that distinguished it completely from the territorial displays of the previous hours. This was not the branch snapping. This was not the circling. This was Bigfoot responding to something specific about this specific man, with an intensity that the ranger said felt, and he used this word carefully, like punishment. The coach was not passive in the encounter. He had apparently attempted to pursue Bigfoot directly after their separation, a decision the ranger called catastrophic, and Bigfoot had simply stopped retreating and met him. The coach lunged first, a desperate haymaker that caught nothing but air, and Bigfoot answered by stepping inside the swing and driving one massive forearm into the coach's chest like a battering ram, lifting him off his feet and hurling him backward into a thicket of devil's club, the spines tearing through his shirt and raking bloody furrows down his back before he even hit the ground. The coach scrambled on all fours, trying to put distance between them, but Bigfoot was already there, one enormous foot coming down on the coach's trailing ankle with a crunch that echoed off the OSE surrounding trees, and the coach screamed and kicked out with his free leg, catching Bigfoot just above the knee with enough force to make the creature grunt. But in something closer to surprise, as if the coach's resistance had crossed some invisible line, Bigfoot reached down and grabbed the coach by the belt and the back of his collar simultaneously, hoisting him off the ground like a rag doll, and then slammed him against a boulder with a wet thud that knocked the breath out of him in a single strangled gasp. The coach's head lolled, his eyes unfocused, but he still had enough fight left to claw at Bigfoot's wrist with both hands, his fingernails raking through thick fur and drawing thin lines of blood that the creature didn't even seem to notice. Bigfoot responded by shifting his grip, one hand now wrapped entirely around the coach's throat, and lifted him until his boots dangled a foot off the ground, then walked him backward 3 slow, deliberate steps and drove him spine first into a standing dead tree, the impact shattering the rotted wood and dropping both of them into a cloud of dust and splinters. The coach fell to his knees, gasping and choking, and for a moment the ranger thought it was over, but the coach's right hand found a fist-sized rock on the ground, and he swung it upward with everything he had left, catching Bigfoot under the jaw with a crack that made the creature's head snap back. Bigfoot staggered half a step, shook its head once like a dog coming out of water, and then its eyes locked onto the coach with an expression that the ranger would later describe as calm, terrible, and utterly final. The coach tried to rise, tried to run, tried to do anything, but Bigfoot's left hand shot out and clamped around his left wrist, and the creature pulled. The coach's shoulder dislocated with a sound like a branch twisting apart, and he howled and tried to pull away, but Bigfoot held him fast, then reached across with his right hand and took the coach by the elbow and began to apply steady, inexorable pressure in the opposite direction. The coach's arm bent where no arm should bend, the bones grinding audibly beneath the skin, and the coach stopped screaming only because he didn't have enough air left to make the sound. And then Bigfoot took the coach apart. Not quickly, not cleanly. The ranger said the creature grabbed the coach by the ankle first, one hand, effortlessly, and swung him into a cedar trunk hard enough to leave bark embedded in fabric. The coach's arm bent wrong, his scream cut off when Bigfoot slammed him down again, this time chest first onto a root system. The ranger heard ribs snap like dry branches. But Bigfoot wasn't finished. The creature was angry, not defensive, not territorial, but furious in a way that suggested recognition, as if the coach had committed something unforgivable. Bigfoot pulled, and the coach came apart in pieces. An arm separated at the shoulder, a leg twisted opposite its joint. By the time Bigfoot dropped what was left, the coach no longer resembled a person. The ranger later told investigators he had never seen an animal, or anything, dismantle a human body with such deliberate, piece-by-piece destruction. The ranger raised his weapon and shouted, his voice breaking harder than he expected in the cold air. Bigfoot's head turned slowly, not reacting to the sound so much as acknowledging it, like a system registering a new input. The ranger described the shift in attention as the single most frightening moment of his life. And this is a man who has worked remote wilderness for 19 years and survived situations where most people never get a second radio call out. Not because Bigfoot moved immediately, not because there was a charge or a display, but because Bigfoot stopped looking at the coach entirely and looked at him instead, with a level of calm that didn't belong in anything that size or that close. There was no aggression in the posture, no escalation cues, just recognition. Like the situation had been reorganized in Bigfoot's mind, and the ranger had been filed under a new category of problem, one that required direct attention but not urgency. That was what broke him internally, according to his own words. Not fear of attack in the abstract, but the certainty that he was already behind whatever process was happening in front of him. His finger tightened instinctively on the trigger. Guard, not firing, just reacting, because every trained part of him was screaming for space that didn't exist anymore. He later said that this was the first time he understood he wasn't in a standoff. He was in an evaluation, and nothing in his experience, nothing in his gear, nothing in the distance between them suggested he was going to pass it. Bigfoot shifted its weight slightly, just enough to change the geometry of the clearing. The movement was subtle, almost casual, but it erased what little advantage the ranger thought he still had. The ranger backed one step without meaning to, and even that small motion felt wrong, like he had surrendered more ground than physics should allow. At that distance, he could see details he didn't want to see. Not brutality, not rage, but certainty. And in that moment, the ranger realized something he later couldn't explain without pausing for a long time. Whatever he was holding wasn't part of the equation anymore. What Bigfoot did after that look, and what happened to the ranger when Bigfoot decided he was next, is the part of this story that made me sit in my car for 20 minutes after the interview ended, before I could drive home. The ranger fired once more, not into the air this time, directly at the ground between himself and Bigfoot, a last attempt deterrent, the kind of shot that is supposed to communicate absolute seriousness to any large animal. Bigfoot flinched at the sound, a slight recoil of the upper body, and then continued moving toward him at the same unhurried, ground-covering pace that the ranger had been hearing all night as footsteps around the tent perimeter. Up close, in daylight, that pace was worse. It wasn't a charge. It was the walk of something that had already done the math and found no reason to rush. The ranger didn't freeze. He moved. He attempted to create distance. He used the terrain. Bigfoot closed the gap not through speed, but through sheer continuity of motion, absorbing every obstacle the ranger put between them. A fallen log, a boulder shelf, a steep bank, the way water moves around rocks without breaking rhythm. When contact came, the ranger described it not as a strike or a grab, but as an overwhelming application of forward momentum that simply removed his ability to remain upright. He went down. He attempted to rise. Bigfoot's hand, and the ranger paused a long time before using that word, hand, came down on his shoulder with a pressure that he said was like having a structural beam laid across him. The ranger was being moved through the forest. Bigfoot was not hurting him anymore. Bigfoot was simply taking him somewhere with a purposefulness that the ranger said was almost harder to process than the violence had been. Where Bigfoot was taking him, and what the ranger found waiting at the end of that journey through the dark, is the conclusion that no investigator, no official report, and no follow-up interview has ever been able to fully explain. The ranger regained full awareness at the forest's edge, less than 40 feet from the access road. Only 9 of the 14 children were already there. Disoriented, silent, physically unharmed, standing in a loose group like they had been placed rather than wandered. None of them could describe how they arrived. Several reported being guided through the forest, but could not describe what guided them. Bigfoot was not present. The coach was recovered separately, further inside the tree line, 2 hours later. What investigators uncovered in the weeks following destroyed whatever remained of his public record entirely. Credible, serious evidence of physical abuse directed at the children in his care. The ranger told me he believes, without reservation, that Bigfoot knew, that the escalation was never random, that every branch, every circling pass, every act of aggression had a single, specific target from the very beginning. No official report confirmed that conclusion. But none of them closed the case either. 6 more kids were missing, and it's unclear what Bigfoot did to any of them.